So good morning from the Big Cypress, and before I get started, just wanted to thank all of you for watching this video, and a big thank you to the subscribers and your comments and your likes. Really appreciate that. So let's get started. Okay, so the last couple of videos I've been talking about how to master exposure and get out of that auto mode and get into the manual mode. And so for this video, what I'd like to do is continue with that. And today I'd like to talk about the technology tools that your camera offers you to help you set up the correct exposure before you even get the shot. So there's three things that I want to talk about today. And the first one is the camera's meter. And that's real easy. That's something that is always available. When you're looking through the viewfinder, you're always going to see the camera's meter, and that's a good thing to always be looking at. It at least tells you if you're underexposing or overexposing, and I like to use that when I'm shooting birds. So the camera's meter, that's good feedback, and before all the fancy technology we have now, that was basically what we had to rely on to get the right exposure. Okay, so the second tool that your camera has is a very powerful one, and that's called Live View. Now, in its simplest form, Live View means that you can see whatever the scene is that you're pointing at, you can see it on your LCD, in addition to seeing through your viewfinder. So you have two options of viewing the scene you're about ready to compose and expose. So Live View is very good. Now, just a word of caution, your back panel or LCD panel captures a lot of ambient light, so it doesn't always look like what the scene looks like. So just be aware that sometimes it's easier to see what it is that you're going to shoot through the viewfinder. Now, the best part about Live View is something called exposure simulation. And what that means is that in Live View, you can actually see the scene as it's being exposed. So as you are adjusting your exposure, whether you're darkening or brightening, you can actually see that change on the LCD panel. On my camera, maybe not all cameras, but on my camera, I can actually see that in the viewfinder as well. Now that's a really, really cool thing. Now, what is better, the viewfinder or the LCD panel? Now, the viewfinder, I personally prefer that, mainly because it's easier for me to see the scene through the viewfinder. That's true with landscapes. I'll always compose looking through the viewfinder and always set my exposure. The LCD panel is useful when I can't get my eye to the viewfinder, like when I have the camera on a tripod next to my boat. I have to rely on the LCD panel. But the viewfinder is always superior to me in that regard. The other thing is the viewfinder, if you're shooting wildlife, you've got to look through the viewfinder. I mean, you need to hold that camera steady if you're hand holding, so having your eye up to the viewfinder is going to help you do that. Not only that, you can track the animal or the bird better when you're eyeing it through the viewfinder. So, so the LCD is a nice thing to have, but more importantly, it's that exposure simulation that's really, really powerful and can really help you get that correct exposure. Okay, so the third tool is your camera's histogram, and that's Live View histogram. So with Live View on, the histogram actually shows how your scene is being exposed. Now, the histogram, without going into great detail, because we could spend a lot of time talking about that, is basically a graph of all the data being captured by your sensor, all the pixel data. And so when you're looking at a histogram, and no two are alike, what you see on the far left side of the graph is the darkest areas of the scene, and what you see on the far right are the brightest parts of the scene, and then midtones and everything else in the middle. So the histogram is going to change as the exposure changes. So if you darken a scene, the histogram is going to shift to the left, and vice versa. If you brighten it, it's going to shift to the right. You can actually see that happening in live view. Now, why is that useful? It's useful to me because, for instance, if I'm shooting a white bird, I don't want to overexpose those feathers. So, you know, I don't want to blow those feathers out. So I'll look at the histogram and make sure that I'm not pushing any pixels up against that right wall of the graph. And likewise, if you're shooting a scene that's relatively dark, but you want to keep some detail, you want to make sure you're not pushing too much of the data up against the left side. So the histogram provides very useful information. Not only that, but if I can't look through the viewfinder and I'm relying on my LCD and I'm looking up at the camera, and all I have is the LCD panel, I want to see that histogram. That's going to give me better feedback than what I'm actually seeing on the back panel or the LCD. So, so the histogram is a very useful tool as well. Okay, so we've talked about the three things that we can use to help us get the correct exposure. We talked about the camera's meter, live view on the LCD and viewfinder, and the exposure simulation that comes with that. And then also we talked about the histogram, the live view histogram. And one thing about the histogram, if you do not use live view, you can still see a histogram through the viewfinder or the LCD, but it's not going to reflect the exposure. It's only going to be reading what's out there. And so you can be adjusting your exposure and that histogram is not going to change. So if you want to use histogram as information to help you get the right exposure, you need to have live view on. In the old days, the histogram was used after the fact. So you would take a shot, then you would review your image on the screen, and you could look at the histogram to see if you need to make an adjustment for the next shot. But now, in live view, you can do that ahead of the taking the shot. So that's very powerful. All right, so to set all that up, you need to go into your camera's menu, and you'll see in the menu there's a place where you can turn live view on or off. In some cameras, there's also an additional menu that's called exposure simulation, and you need to turn that on as well. So once you have live view on, remember the battery life is going to deplete a lot faster. All right, so the other thing that you want to do is you want to see the histogram, if you can, on your viewfinder, but also your LCD panel. So you should have a menu for both the viewfinder as well as the back panel or LCD panel. So look at your options and set that up. As an example, when I'm looking through the viewfinder, I have two different versions. I have one where I don't have any data showing, and then I have one where I just have the histogram, and all I have to do is hit a button just to kind of scroll back and forth. So when I'm composing a scene, I can remove the histogram so I can see the entire scene, and then when I'm ready to do the exposure, I just bring back the histogram. All right, so set up your displays, get your live view on, and go out there and practice getting the correct exposure. Get used to using each of them and learn what the limitations are for each, and also learn what situations where one works better than the other. And I guarantee you, the more you practice that and get used to using those tools that your camera has, the more likely your scenes are going to be exposed correctly every single time. And that kind of frees you up to become more creative and really work on your composition and getting the right lighting and all of that. So yeah, so go out there and have fun.